And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome. Good morning. This is the official launch of Georgetown's Global TechNet Working Group. Welcome to our founding fellows who are joining us and to our esteemed panelists who will be starting our discussion today with social media and elections elsewhere, Myanmar, Facebook, and the future of democracy. For those of you who are in the US, thank you for taking the time before what will be a heated election day tomorrow to discuss social media and elections in the US, but beyond, more importantly, social media and elections elsewhere. I'm Hillary Brill. I lead Georgetown's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, which is a think tank at Georgetown Law that provides deep expertise to students from our esteemed faculty. And we provide programs for our students and our greater community, which convenes thought leaders and academics to discuss issues at the intersection of technology, law, and policy, issues such as AI and bias, platform governance, general data governance, intellectual property and technology, and more. Today marks the start of our new initiative, and our Georgetown Global TechNet Working Group is a group of international it's an international cohort centered on research in technology and policy with a global impact. The working group is housed at the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. The idea stemmed from a conversation with Professor Chander, and it was a discussion of the opportunity that can actually be found during the pandemic when virtual gatherings became the norm and eliminated barriers otherwise placed on international voices in the global conversation in technology and policy. Most conversations can be dominated by a US or Western view here in the US or in Western convenings and academia. And the goal of our Global TechNet is to bring geographically diverse views and voices into the discussion. The group is going to meet in both public forums such as this, but also have its own workshops and research agenda. And we are looking forward to the social impact that will arise from these fellows collaborating together. I want a special thank you to a few people that made this new initiative possible. I want to thank Sienna Tompkins, who's with the School of Foreign Service, who helped launch and start this program. And I want to thank the Institute's very own Prince Albert, who is a fellow working, a fellow with us at the Institute. And of course, all of our Institute staff and faculty directors that made this possible. Our group is led by Georgetown's very own Professor Anupam Chander. He's going to lead today's discussion on the impact of social media and global elections. Professor Chander is an expert on many things, including global regulation of new technologies. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. He clerked for Chief Judge Newman of the Second Circuit and Judge Norris of the Ninth Circuit. And he has practiced law in New York and Hong Kong. And he has been a visiting law professor at Yale, University of Chicago, Stanford, Cornell, and we're happy that you stayed put here at Georgetown. He is the author of also The Electronic Silk Road. Our panelist, Professor Jenny Domino from the University of Philippines, is a Filipino-Chinese human rights lawyer whose research focuses on many things, including hate speech, social media regulation, and business and human rights. And a lot of it has been informed by her practical work in Myanmar and the Philippines, and she is a graduate of Harvard Law School. We also welcome Erica George, a professor of the University of Utah, who is a special counsel to the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. And she is also a graduate from Harvard Law and has an international relations master's from University of Chicago. She has served as a law clerk for Judge Hart on the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. And we also welcome Professor Chinmayi Arun, Assistant Professor of Law at the National Law University of Delhi. You are also an affiliate at Berkman-Klein Center at Harvard and a resident fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Your recent writing has focused on online propaganda and the impact of AI and algorithms on human rights in the Global South. You also write and have lectures on questions of platform governance, surveillance, digital identity, and the right to privacy. We are very fortunate to have such esteemed international colleagues to jumpstart our new initiative. And with that, I know all of you are waiting for them to speak, so I pass along to you, Professor Chander. Thank you very much for attending.
Thanks very much, Hillary. And I want to begin by thanking you, Hillary, for taking an idea that we had over a conversation on the phone and making it a reality. I'm really excited about, as you are, about the things that we can do together and the opportunities that we've seen with respect to kind of global collaboration using these online spaces. And I want to thank Prince as well for doing all the hard work behind the scenes, and Sienna Tompkins, who did a lot of the hard work before Prince took up the baton. So let me begin with. So the way we've organized this is that Jenny is going to speak first, and then Chinmay, and then Erica. And I'm going to ask a couple questions to each of them. So to kind of set the stage here. So last week, we saw Jack Dorsey, Sundar Pichai, and Mark Zuckerberg, the CEOs of Twitter, Google, and Facebook, politely listening as they were rebuked by members of Congress, one after the other. Would they appear before legislatures in Africa, Latin America, or Asia? It seems unlikely. After all, Zuckerberg has previously refused to testify before the UK Parliament. Social media, we know, can play an especially critical role in elections, but we are much more likely to critically examine that role in the United States or other wealthy countries while neglecting its role in the global South. This last week, there was an election in Tanzania where the ruling party appears to have shut off Facebook and other social media for the whole country just before the election. But that fact passed with barely any notice here in the United States. Now, to help us understand the role of social media across the world, I want to begin asking Professor Domino to tell us a bit about the history of Facebook in Myanmar, where there's an election coming up this Sunday. Professor Domino.
Thank you so much, Anupam. If I may share my screen to facilitate my presentation. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank this initiative. I'd like to thank Georgetown Law for making me a part of the Global TechNet Working Group and for allowing me to deliver this presentation during the launch. I'd just like to qualify that I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. But I'd like to use this opportunity to illustrate why this working group is so necessary and why Georgetown's initiative is so wonderful. Okay, wait. Right. So many of you here might already be familiar with this, that in 2018, the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar came out with a report. I think that was around September of 2018. And they found that serious human rights violations, potentially constituting crimes under international law, happened in Myanmar, in various parts of the country, but particularly more intensely in Rakhine State. And you might have heard from news that there is an ongoing Rohingya refugee crisis, where you have hundreds of thousands of Rohingya coming over to Bangladesh, and were displaced from their home in Rakhine State in Myanmar, and this culminated in 2017. Now, in that same report, interestingly, the UN fact-finding mission also found that Facebook played a significant role in the spread of hateful and divisive rhetoric targeting the Rohingya. And this is especially important in a country such as Myanmar, where, according to the FFM, Facebook is the internet. And because Facebook has such an outsized presence in a country that had just recently opened up to the world, propagators of hate speech resorted to Facebook to wage hate campaigns, amplify their message, and reach new audiences to spread misinformation and hate speech and incitement to violence against the ethnic group. And the propagators of hate speech include civilian government officials and military officials. Now, because of that UN fact-finding mission report in 2018, that triggered a whole set of developments in international law. So after the fact-finding mission on Myanmar's mandate ended, a new mechanism, a new UN body was created called the Independent Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar, or the IIMM, which is currently operational now. Then you have also the International Criminal Court issue a ruling in 2018 saying that the ICC can look into potential crimes that were committed, and which and in which part of the crime was committed in Bangladesh, which is a state party to the Rome Statute, which created the ICC. So, as you know, Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, but because part of the crime if part of the crime is found to have occurred in Bangladesh, then that could also be the subject of ICC investigation. And at the moment, there is already an ongoing investigation with respect to the Bangladesh Myanmar situation. And then in late 2019, the Burma Rohingya Organization UK, it's a civil society organization based in the UK, filed a case for genocide and crimes against humanity in Argentina under the concept of universal jurisdiction. And this case is currently still ongoing. And then you have perhaps the most famous, the Gambia filed an application before the International Court of Justice, also in late 2019, against Myanmar for Myanmar's alleged violation of the Genocide Convention. And I should note here that under the Genocide Convention, one of the punishable acts is the direct and public incitement to genocide, which is a speech crime. And in relation to that, the Gambia versus Myanmar ICJ proceeding, the Gambia this year, June of this year, filed a request for discovery at the DC District Courts against Facebook to compel the platform to provide data on military pages and accounts that were taken down by Facebook, in the hopes that the Gambia would be able to use that in the ICJ proceeding. So these developments are partly inspired as well by Facebook's inaction in Myanmar, in the country, and what it did after. So in late August 2018, as facing mounting scrutiny from its actions in the US, in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in the foreign electoral interference um, that was suddenly discovered at that time, Facebook decided to remove accounts and pages of Myanmar military officials from the platform. And one of the most remarkable removals or bans of Facebook was removing the account of the commander in chief of Myanmar, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and other military figures. And so these accounts were the ones that the Gambia was referring to in its discovery request. And so, among other things, Facebook also removed ethnic armed organizations from the platform. They also removed outspoken the outspoken Buddhist monk Ashin Wiratu, which was really who was really one of the key figures in spreading hate speech in the country. And they commissioned a human rights impact assessment. So they launched a whole new set of improvements to hopefully improve the way they were operating the platform in Myanmar. So now on the right side, the picture that you see is Facebook and what it's doing to prepare for the Myanmar 2020 election. And some of these initiatives you can find on their website, but let me just mention a few. So they have expanded their third-party fact-checking. They have also implemented more ad transparency and messenger forwarding limits, and they have also supposedly improve their detection of hate speech on the platform. And lastly, they have also taken down accounts and pages for coordinated inauthentic behavior. And I should say that they also hold regular briefings to civil society for about a few months now in the lead up to the elections. But yeah. So these are just pictures of the current of what's happening here in Myanmar. So actually, voting has already started for the elderly last week. And the picture on your left, you see voters over 60 in Yangon here casting their votes. And then on the right, you see the state councilor, Do Aung San Suu Kyi, also casting her vote. So this is just to show you what's already happening here. But I should say at this point that about 1.5 million people in Rakhine State will not be able to vote during this election cycle because the Union Electoral Commission canceled elections over there, supposedly due to the ongoing conflict between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military. But some civil society groups have criticized this for the lack of transparency over these determinations. And this, I wanted to end with this slide because I think this ties in to the Global TechNet Working Group and why it's so necessary. So one of the famous initiatives that Facebook decided to implement as a way to stop some of the issues that we're encountering in terms of content moderation on the platform is to create this Facebook oversight board. And in May of this year, the first set of 20 members were announced. And last week, they also announced that they are starting to accept cases for their review. So interestingly, if you look at the bylaws of the Facebook Oversight Board, there's no rule on equitable geographic representation. And in fact, you can go for 6 months. Well, they will, to be fair, under the bylaws, they will try to fill that slot as best as they can. But in the interim, that could go on for 6 months without somebody from that geographic region participating in the decision of a case or of a particular content that affects that region. Currently, 5 of 20 members are from the US. And interestingly, so the US and Canada is one geographic block under the bylaws. And interestingly, the US and Canada have the lowest number of active users on the platform. But Facebook has represented, and this might well be true, Facebook has represented that most of the complaints come from the US. But then you have a chicken egg problem, right? Because if people in other parts of the world are not even familiar of the complaint mechanisms, of the appeal procedures, or even of the oversight board, then you would really have fewer people complaining you will really have fewer people complaining from this side of the world. And so given what happened in Myanmar in 2018, I forgot to mention that Mark Zuckerberg actually mentioned Myanmar in his plan to create an oversight board. And so this ties into my next point, which is that Southeast Asia is actually part of the Asia Pacific and Oceania group. And with the current slate, there are 3 members, one from Indonesia, one from Taiwan, and one from Australia. And South Asia, India, the representatives from India and I forget the other one are Pakistan. India and Pakistan are part of the South Asia group. So lawyers, whether rightly or wrongly, lawyers comprise a supermajority of the oversight board. 4 of the 10 law professors on the board are from the US. If you mix the law professors with the practitioners as a whole, then there's better diversity among geographic regions. But I think we can't deny that with the current slate, there is a predominance in legal influence, and that is US perspective. And for example, constitutional expertise is predominantly US constitutional law expertise. And so I think I want to end with the question, who is the legal expert? And this ties in perfectly with the launch of the Global TechNet Working Group, because as we know, and or as international lawyers may be familiar with, this was already asked by Anthea Roberts in her famous book, Is international law international? And her book actually shows that it's not as international as we would like to imagine. And it you might wonder, what does it matter who the people interpreting all these norms are, if the norms that we're applying is international human rights law anyway, or Facebook's community standards, which is global and uniform around the world anyway? Well, it matters a lot with respect to speech, because the way a lawyer will apply and interpret international norms will depend on the legal training and the legal orientation of that lawyer. And so, therefore, I really, really applaud the initiative of Georgetown Institute of Tech Law and Policy for this working group, because now it's more possible to really explore solutions together, bringing in different voices from all over the world. And I'd like to end this presentation by saying that, the global south has been used to exemplify problems of technology. There are many reports i- in US outlets. There are many reports of how Facebook did a very bad job in many places. But I also hope that in exploring solutions, lawyers can band together all over the world and approach this problem together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was absolutely terrific. And your call for us thinking about what law is applied and who interprets that law is obviously critical and really part of the founding ethos of this group. So, Professor Arun, you have written important work on social media across the world, and you've described, for example, WhatsApp, which is a Facebook app, its role in India, even its role in spreading rumors that lead to lynchings, sadly. But you've also described issues of AI responsibility across the world. How do we create systems that are globally responsible? How should we think about the role of social media based in one jurisdiction and the responsibilities that it has to the people of other countries?
Thank you, Professor Chandar, for having me be a part of this wonderful session, firstly. And thank you, Jenny, for the wonderful presentation that I agree with. And you'll see how much soon. And I also want to thank the Georgetown TechNet team for bringing all this together before I start. So I've got a slightly messy presentation, well, a few slides really, that I'm going to share with you to sort of illustrate the journey of this. But to give you a little background before I start, I've been working on this and engaging with social media companies in India since 2012. And so I've been following this story as it progressed and as the many players in this learned, and in their defense, they've been evolving as they've gone along. And I'll show you a little bit how this has changed once I successfully share my slides. But I do want to point out this valuable thing that the Jenny just said in her presentation about the Western centricity of the discourse and how valuable Georgetown's TechNet is in changing that. I think that is particularly interesting if we think of how Facebook in particular, but Google as well, I don't want to pick on one company, went to great lengths to bring people in southern countries on board. And so all of you may have followed free basics and the zero rating controversy. And that was really a device to make sure that a lot of people were using the platform. And I think that background is important when we think about the fact that a huge part, a huge section of the company's markets are based in southern countries. And in fact, India has many more Facebook users than any other country. And so you might ask the question that Jenny asks in a different way, which is that why is there only one law professor from India on the Facebook oversight board? Granting them this, that they may have asked more than one. But the way the board is composed, as she says, will influence the way it thinks. So I quickly wanted to take you through a spectrum of social media harms to give you a sense of how this engagement between people in a southern country like India and a Western platform like Facebook has evolved over time and what's missing. And so the first is really, initially, it was a question of legibility of the harms that took place locally to the company at all. And those were things like language in part, but also things like this slide, which was actually one of my favorite jazz clubs in Delhi, that posted this event with what is essentially a very offensive caste name in its title. And the thing is that even I, who grew up in a liberal, admittedly privileged bubble in a city, didn't recognize that for the caste slur it was, because I'd never heard it before. But to someone who is at the receiving end of that slur, it's deeply offensive. And it triggered a huge debate actually with the jazz club about canceling the event. But also tangentially, it raised questions of why Facebook doesn't deal with caste, which it didn't back then, and it does now. And so it's been a conversation, as you can imagine, as the company's expanded its markets and as it's engaged more with local experts. At that time, you couldn't get this taken down from Facebook because it was not racist speech as Facebook saw it. Now you possibly can. The second problem, I'm moving through this a little fast, and if anyone's curious about parts of it, maybe we can discuss it in question and answers. The second kind of problem that's been raised by the global companies' operations in countries like India is that as their markets have expanded, they are more reluctant to damage their business interests. And so this picture is one of what many Kashmiris would call a freedom fighter, and the Indian government would call a terrorist, Burhan Wani. He was young and he was killed quite early. He was a polarizing figure. I'm not going to offer any opinions about what he was and what he wasn't. But all images of Burhan Wani ended up being censored on Facebook. This includes posts by professors in the US and in the UK saying that a lot of people in Kashmir are moved by the fact that he's killed and have attended his funeral. Even that fact was being removed from Facebook. And so that created a second tension of when the Indian state wants something removed, which actually may or may not be correct implementation of Indian laws and may or may not be in accordance with the Indian constitution. A lot of the times it's in the platform's interests to cooperate. And that can lead to pretty heavy-handed censorship. And in the context of a state like Kashmir, which is already under fire from the Indian state at large, you might say that it has consequences for people's rights, because there's a lot that they aren't able to say. There was a point at which Facebook regarded the phrase "Free Kashmir" as a violation of Indian law, which it's not. And so this sort of broad interpretation of Indian law can also affect people locally, and that's, again, it's a complicated situation that the companies have to deal with. And then here's this mess for you, sorry, which is, sorry, let me just take that back, which is a series of problems that arose recently in the context of Facebook. One has to do with the WhatsApp lynchings, which Anupam alluded to, and the others, and the other had to do with the others had to do with the elections and with the recent controversy that has to do with the head of public policy in India, who was apparently who allegedly offered an opinion about a dangerous speaker on Facebook, recommending that the speaker shouldn't be blocked. And I want to unpack this a little, and then I don't want to take up too much time. So there are two tangled questions here, right? And we began with discussing the question of elections. So there's hate speech which leads to lynching, And then there's the question of politicians weaponizing hate speech in the interests of elections, which I think a lot of us are beginning to see around the world. And that's complicated by the fact that when a political leader speaks hatefully, their speech is more influential and powerful than other people's speech. But silencing them has great consequences for businesses in most countries, including India. And that creates a difficult dynamic, which is what the Wall Street Journal's been getting at through its coverage of Facebook in India, which is that on one hand, the company has policies about hate speech and prevention of harm that it's trying to implement, and that's taking down hateful content that might trigger violence, or removing entirely a speaker that has a habit of continuously inciting violence, and those are the dangerous speakers. But when they do that, they also talk to their local teams. And some of their local teams are required to engage with governments to keep the other aspects of their business and their market in order. And so the feedback that they might get from their government affairs teams might be that that taking down speech or a particular speaker would impact the business in ways that aren't ideal. And I think that puts the company in an interesting quandary where they do want to expand their business in markets and they don't want to get banned in other countries. And here's conjecture: possibly they don't care as much if it's not their own country. And they end up making choices that have horrific consequences elsewhere. And then they're like, oh my God, we can't believe that happened, but it's too late. So I'm going to stop here at that cheerful thought. I don't know if you saw my little cat picture. It was in my thank you slide. It was just because I was telling you all these depressing things,
I very much appreciated the cat. The little kitten was very cute, and it wanted to peek out a number of times, I saw. So thanks, Chinmayi, and those are all very sobering remarks, and it's important to remember that India is the biggest population for Facebook. And so, we think of Facebook as an American company, but if you look at its impact, we should recognize it's actually a company that has its greatest impact outside the United States in countries, across Africa and Asia and Latin America. So, Professor George, your work has been about corporate social responsibility. You began your career working for Human Rights Watch, and so you've really brought a human rights lens to all your work. How should we think about the corporate social responsibility in the context of companies like Facebook and Google and and all and smaller players as well? So it's not just the very large entities; it's all the smaller entities that are operating all over as well. So what are some broad lessons that we might or approaches that we might follow?
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Anupam. We go way back. I've long admired his work. It is so fitting that he's bringing together people from around the world to talk about these pressing issues, and I'm just deeply privileged to be a part of it. Thank you. And thank you to the Georgetown team and my co-panelists. And thank you for the question about business responsibility and human rights. It's one I've been asking myself practically since law school. So let me share my screen here. And I also appreciate the reference to my former colleagues. I did start my legal career at Human Rights Watch, and they have been watching this space for a long time now. And we do think of Facebook as an American company, but in point of fact, just recently, colleagues at Human Rights Watch have pointed out that 90% of Facebook's membership or users are outside of the United States. And that's tremendous. And to the hypothetical question posed earlier at the introduction by Professor Chander, would these tech titans appear before the governments of these nations that they're deeply affecting? It is far from clear to me that that would be the case. Arguably, they would have a responsibility to do so. So I have been given a short amount of time to bring this into a broader context and talk about what the obligations of these business enterprises are. They're private actors having a tremendous impact on our public discourse. For nearly a decade, I have been working on trying to sort out strategies to advance corporate social responsibility and accountability And we're making progress, but we are facing greater challenges. I came to this issue looking at extractive industry companies. I know now data is termed to be the new oil. So it's fitting that we have this conversation now. And it's critically important to convene. And again, thank you to Professor Chanda for giving us the forum. A bit about things that have worked. Actually, advocacy works. We've seen adjudication in lawsuits. While these may not result in awards, they have raised awareness and they've changed a conversation where before you would have a business say, we have no responsibility, this has nothing to do with us. You can't really credibly make that argument anymore. In addition, there's advocacy, and we are using these platforms to point out their problems. So there's that paradox. And then finally, there are multi-stakeholder engagements. So the last time, the first round of human rights conflicts that these major companies had, they formed a global network initiative to try to figure out what policy should look like in the absence of regulation. And we've seen that regulation has been woefully inadequate. So I'm interested in the space beyond regulation because I'm not sure when we'll get it. And I think it's important to look way back and recognize that technology companies in some form have long been implicated, connected to, contributing to, or in some instances causing massive human rights violations. And with this knowledge, it's imperative that we do what we can to stop that. My students, when I teach a business and human rights seminar, hadn't realized that IBM manufactured the punch cards to keep track of the people detained and later executed by the German Nazi regime. But for the technology, one wonders if the velocity of that violence would have been quite as strong. But we didn't ask those questions. These companies were never on trial. Certain individual German industrialists were, but really linking the ways in which private power and commerce can contribute to violence and violations has been the contribution of the most recent wave of the human rights movement. So as Professor Chander explained, I do look at through a human rights lens with most things that I look at. I look at securities law in this way and corporate governance in this way. And right now I've been very interested in the policy pronouncements that have been put forth by the United Nations. And the two questions I wanted to speak to were, what should states be doing right now? What should companies be doing right now globally? So in 2011, the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the principles on business and human rights. This is a framework that outlines that far from having nothing to do with human rights violations, there's actually an affirmative obligation that businesses have to respect human rights. While it is the province of the state to protect human rights, that means passing laws and ensuring there's the policy space to protect the people within your jurisdiction. And respect has taken on a different content that we're still giving meaning to. And I think the example of the tech sector in emerging market economies is important to look at in this respect. So respecting rights at minimum means you have a policy commitment, and Ginny talked about the many policy commitments that Facebook has introduced in response to criticism. In addition to policy commitments, one must commit that policy to being implemented and affirmatively conduct in advance human rights due diligence and human rights impact assessments. Our challenge is it's not clear what's being done with the diligence and whether these impacts are really rising to the level that they should be in our broader global policy arena and in the states that are affected. So the right that's at risk is one that is guaranteed universally. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 21 tells us that each of us have the right to participate in our government. And while they don't necessarily adhere to a particular form of government, at minimum, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his or her country directly or through freely chosen representatives. And paradoxically, the free speech in the variant that we have seen it exported to the developing and emerging market economy world is, as Denny pointed out, deeply influenced by a libertarian approach to freedom of expression that, at least if an American lawyer or a US-based lawyer is thinking about this, is far less limited than the balancing approaches taken in other places. So there is that. There's a strong influence on not wanting to regulate. And we're left with businesses self-regulating, moderating content, making up the rules for their content moderation in ways that are perhaps less than democratic, and they've got this outsized impact on what the democratic process should guarantee, which is the will of the people, the consent of the governed. So I think that is the heart of the challenge. I know that we're looking outside or elsewhere, but I am based in the United States, and I've been really struck by the amplification of incitement language that may intimidate voters from exercising what should be a globally recognized right. So we are seeing things that, frankly, the colleagues I worked with at Human Rights Watch would be watching elsewhere. So this has really been a moment for looking within for me. So the responsibility, respect, and what is being weighed. One of the challenges, at least with respect to Facebook, is the way the business model privileges and amplifies what does cause outrage, what does potentially lead to incitement. And Jenny mentioned the Facebook Oversight Board recently, so I just threw this in the slide a second ago. There's a real Facebook Oversight Board, which is not the real Facebook Oversight Board. They don't necessarily have oversight power. It remains to be seen how much power the actual oversight board has. But what their provocation is demanding more disclosure around the impacts that these businesses are having on democracy. And I think that's a very important enterprise to engage. The things that would be consistent with respect for human rights, at least on the business side of things, would be in terms of policy commitments, having hate speech and violent extremism policies actually be proactive in their content moderation, but proportionate and least restrictive. And particularly where there are alternative means of communication, we'd be less concerned about that. But as Jenny mentioned, the Myanmar report demonstrated that Facebook was the internet, or is the internet in that country. So the kinds of freedoms and liberties that we usually would understand are in fact captured. There aren't alternative channels in ways that mitigate the kinds of risks that are presented when content isn't moderated, and particularly where it's violent. I also like to draw a distinction in our analysis of expression that centers power. Professor Arun mentioned this: powerful actors have a platform, whether it was given to them or not on Twitter or Facebook. There are ways that they can amplify voices and target vulnerable communities that don't have voices that are as loud or are moderated off of platforms or are otherwise silenced. So dissent is an important part of the democratic process. And this platform, or these platforms, are mediating that, and we need to look very critically at how that's happening. Linked somewhat is equity, diversity, and inclusion in these companies. Ginny talked about the demographic, let's say, of the actual Facebook Oversight Board. But if we were to look actually at Facebook, Twitter, Google, the businesses themselves, we would not see a great deal of diversity. I know we've talked about South Asia and the Indian subcontinent. People don't talk about this, but quite frankly, there's replication of caste privilege within the tech sector. And that's sensitive, but something we perhaps should be mindful of. So to the extent that there has been expressed discrimination and disdain within that industry sector, one worries that that translates into the types of products that are designed, what's overlooked and what's not taken account of. So for the last thing I'd recommend on the corporate responsibility piece is, particularly for the tech sector, putting human rights in the design at the inception of products. I'm not less convinced that that's likely to happen without a diverse range of engineers, designs, people working in and with these industries to make that change. The other part of this policy initiative is the state responsibility to protect. This is challenging in the sector of tech because governments are often trying to deploy tech in ways to shore up their power, silence dissent, but it is important. I think a global standard is necessary here. States can be working bilaterally, should be working multilaterally, and should be engaged in multi-stakeholder conversations, both interagency and intergovernmental, to look at ways that they can protect and promote, insisting on implementation of international human rights law, Article 19, freedom of expression, Article 21, ability to participate, freedom of conscience, appreciating also equality and non-discrimination are global norms. Convening and facilitating is something that's a powerful capacity that states have. A generation ago, when human rights lawyers were concerned about, we still are, sweatshops and labor rights violations, the US government, the UK government convened and created a multi-stakeholder conversation that later became a fair labor association that does auditing, that does monitoring. It has changed the lives of people working in global supply chains. We need something akin to that potentially. And it'd be wonderful to see governments from the global South taking on these questions. South Africa and Ecuador actually came together to put forward a draft working treaty to regulate business and human rights globally. So the activity is happening, and it's something that I think we as scholars can inform with research. And then the final piece of this, and it is truly missing, is remedy. What is the remedy for someone who's been the victim of hate speech or incitement? What is the remedy for someone who's foreclosed from participating in the government or his or her society? And to the extent that businesses are causing, contributing, or connected to that, we as users, consumers, voters, scholars, those of us wanting to be engaged in this conversation, I hope that these are topics we'll take up.
Thank you very much, Professor George. That was terrific. And, in some sense, that was actually more hopeful than I expected. And so your discussion of past human rights crises as corporations operate globally, and the idea that there had been responses and there had been an ability to improve the facts on the ground, for example, to try to reduce the sweatshop labor and things like that, I think is study and suggests kind of ways that we could borrow those examples. This is not the first time that corporations have acted across the world and have had global impact, right? And your example of IBM, of course, in the tech sector begins, it tells us that very, very clearly. So there have been a number of questions submitted, and I'm going to just tee up one of them first. And I wanted to ask Jenny this. This is a question from Gayatri, she asks, in the elections campaign in Myanmar, do you see the same level of hate campaign going on? And how far are national laws used to tackle legitimate limitations, or are they being used to silence dissent? So what's the role of national law in a place like Myanmar and what's the, what is going on currently with respect to the level of hate that is being expressed in social media?
Thanks for that question, Gayatri. With respect to national laws, actually, civil society groups have commented that under the current administration, there has been more prosecution of dissenters and journalists and human rights defenders using a slew of different defamation laws, telecommunication. There's a defamation provision, if I remember correctly, under the 2013 telecommunications law. There's been a prosecution for under the peaceful assembly law. So, and if I may share one brief story, a few months ago, there's a famous activist here, Maung Sangka, who was protesting against the internet shutdown in Rakhine State, and he was filed charges for violating the peaceful assembly law. So that's the current state here in Myanmar with respect to freedom of expression. And with respect to the levels of hate campaign, so I only arrived in Myanmar in 2018, well after all this had happened already. So I don't have any firsthand experience, but based on my research, I would say that now there is less compared to I mean, I don't know if that's accurate, because the thing that happened before that was the subject of the UN FFM report is with respect to a particular issue, right? In Rakhine State, violence, and that had been going on for decades. So, and now the subject of your question is really just about the election. So I don't think they're comparable in that sense. Thank you.
And, so one of the questions that we're asked by Stephanie, and I think this is reminds me to say, the goal of this session is not to pick on Facebook in particular. It's the reality is that all these companies have these huge kind of impacts across the world, and so it's important to consider their role. And we've seen as Chinmay in particular pointed out, lots of evolution in Facebook's own behavior. And so in that sense, kind of the result of lobbying and activism bearing some fruit as more, as Professor George suggested. And so one of the questions we're asked is from Stephanie. She says, and this is kind of goes to what the remedies might be. She writes, in developed countries, the focus is in antitrust is to mitigate domestic harms. And how might that kind of fail when you're focused on domestic harms? How might the remedies fail to consider the implications for people across the world? It's a difficult question, but I'm wondering if any of you want to take that up. Chinmay?
I'm not an antitrust expert, but there are two interesting questions that come out of this, right? I've often asked myself this very important question, Stephanie, of if Facebook had never been allowed to buy WhatsApp, what would that have meant? Because right now, the way the negotiation happens between the Indian government and the company is that it's the single point, right? It's one company that stands to lose double the market, essentially, actually triple if you take Instagram into account. And so one might argue that different services at least means different points of negotiation. But there's one more thing that I want to add to this, while not advocating for any kind of technology monopoly, which is that that depending on how authoritarian a state is leaning, it can sometimes be local business. So in India, that would be Reliance with Reliance Jio, which is kind of its huge technology arm. They tend to push for the regulation of the foreign companies because they stand to gain from it. And they're actually more captured because they're Indian industry and have very little interest a lot of the times in pushing back the government. And so Facebook, Google, and I think Amazon or Microsoft, I'm not sure which, have started buying 10% stakes each in this local company because there's talk of data localization. And so when we think of local markets, it's helpful to think about what's already in there and what's coming from outside.
And we have Freya Aziz joining us. She's the co-founder of Bolo Bee in Pakistan. And so she asks an important question. To what extent do you think companies grasp the local context? Imagine trying to operate in Tanzania and Myanmar and in the various states of India, which are all different, in a context in and of themselves. So when you have language nuance and when it comes to issues of content moderation, how does one grapple with these things? And your example, Chinmay, of the local Facebook executive is actually, comes to mind a little bit in this context, which is you had a local Facebook executive, but the problem was that her views were aligned with one party in a particular, and that was also in its own way problematic. So even having a local representative may not actually improve content moderation in its own way. And Chinmay, I'm going to put that back to you because I've already discussed what you were talking about earlier.
Thank you, Anupam. You're right. Well, So the example that I started with, the caste one, was in part to show you that if there's someone with caste privilege, which I have, we are not the right people to ask these questions to, just because of how blind we are, as much as we try. And so Professor George, thank you for pointing out that caste privilege also translates to people from countries that move across borders and work in the companies. Faria's question is very astute, because the other thing is that the media ecosystem in different states within the country is different. I think the only answer to that question is that if you have a market as big as India, you have to invest in getting enough people to get some sense of what's actually going on. And I do want to hand it to Facebook that over the years they have been making that effort. I think that the questions that Professor Domino raises about the oversight board are valid, and also valid, by the way, for the real oversight board, which also I believe only has one Indian on it. But it's a progression, and initiatives like this are a way of having a conversation and saying, hey, do you think this is enough?
Professor Domino, any thoughts on this last question about content moderation across the world and the varying cultures, languages, and nuances that are required?
I think that would require a range of solutions. So I don't think there's one way to address that problem. So that could be expanding, as what Chinmayi already said, that could be expanding the team that's working on the ground. And I think she raised a really important point about who you're hiring to be part of that team. And then you also have the dialects used to among the fluency of the human moderators. Because, for example, in Myanmar, if you look at the press statements of Facebook, they always say we've hired Burmese language moderators, but how about the Rohingya dialect, other dialects? We don't know, and there's no information on that. So, and I think part of the problem that I also want to raise here, and I do give credit to Facebook for giving more effort. I do agree with that, with what Chinmayi said. But I think part of the problem is also that, these teams, interestingly, they're just one big global company, but they're operating in different parts of the world. And we don't know what those arrangements are. And I think this is another thing that business and human rights issue, like what are the labor arrangements? How do they enter these countries? What corporate structures? And I think these things should be the subject of further research and collaboration among us scholars and lawyers.
Terrific. Professor George, I'm going to give you the last word. Do you have anything hopeful to offer from your experiences?
Oh, I wish I had a kitten slide or a puppy slide or something. To this last exchange on context and locality and expertise, we hadn't yet mentioned the Rabat plan of action, so I just wanted to leave people with that. I think that's a good map, right? It says that we need to look at, or moderators should be considering, the social and political context in which they're operating. When I read, Ginny has an amazing piece in Just Security, I followed a lot of those links. If you read the UN report, Facebook was made aware that perhaps they didn't have the right language capacity to understand nuance. And then I'm like, well, why are you operating in a space that you know nothing about? We wouldn't think that way in other industry contexts, right? We would want the pilots to know how to fly a plane. The status of the speaker, again, the power dynamic, that has been largely absent for the way we think about freedom of expression, and we have to bring the power dynamic back in. Intent, there are bad actors that are intending to do bad things. The content and form of the speech, the extent of its dissemination, let's slow the spread or slow the speed. I've noticed that Twitter now is asking you, do you want to share this before you share it? So there are ways to maybe change how things disseminate. And then the likelihood of harm and imminence, which is perhaps hard for us to know. But the other things are things that we can learn more about, and we need to be doing about that. We're educators, we're teachers, we're researchers, we can learn. I do believe ideas and information can change the world. And I do believe we can do more to slow the speed of disinformation and misinformation.
Thank you all so much. I was trying to take a quick screenshot of our gathering. So thank you all. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to further conversations. And thank you, Hillary, for everything. Thanks all.